Hi, I'm Marc Lynch, Director of the Project on Middle East Political Science and the Institute for Middle East Studies at George Washington University. Welcome back to the POMEPS Conversations, our series of conversations with leading scholars in the field. With me today we have Philip Howard of the University of Washington Department of Communication and Muzammil Hussain, also of the University of Washington's Department of Communication. Phil and Muzammil have a new book out, Democracy's Fourth Wave, Digital Media and the Arab Spring, out with Oxford University Press, and been writing about digital media, the internet, a whole range of issues for quite some time. So I thought a good place to start would just be to say, tell us about the book.
Well, the book makes the argument that digital media is very important to the storyline of the Arab Spring. And there are several other books that are about the Arab Spring. You've published one of them that provide great context. And so this is a fairly focused study of the role of media in the ignition phase, the organization, the movement on the ground, the information war that followed afterwards, and that tipping point moment where we knew Egypt was falling apart, the state was falling apart because they went dark, they went off the internet. And so this is a focused look at the role of digital media in that storyline.
So tell me, how did you do it? I mean, what were some of the things that you did to try and really get at the role of digital media?
I think the organization of the book is something we thought quite a bit about. Each chapter focuses on a different angle of information technology and ICT usage. So we have chapters on civil society and activists, how there's a long history of the strategies and experiments they've conducted across countries. We have a chapter on regimes and the different intervention styles and censorship protocols that have come in place over the past recent few years. We focus extensively on broadcast media as well. All of these different foci pay attention to the several different angles in which technology infrastructure has become a political tool, as well as something that several stakeholders contest over.
Mm-hmm. Well, walk me through one of the arguments. I mean, an area where you think that the book makes a real advance on kind of the state of the art or the conventional wisdom.
Conventional wisdom. I think there are three things we say that sort of contravene this, or bring new light, shed new light, and contravene this conventional wisdom. The first thing we argue is that the importance of digital media was not just around the month of the Arab Spring. There's actually a much longer, recent history of digital media use by civil society actors. In Egypt, for many years, for the last 5-6 years, the biggest protests on the streets of Cairo were either about the arrests of bloggers, or they were organized by bloggers. So digital media has for several years been an important part of civic activism in these countries. The other myth I think we try to dispel is that dictators don't learn, right? There's this learning curve, and eventually they figure out that they too can use digital media for social control. And I think one of the things we agree on is that it's often the activists who are most desperate and most creative with digital media. They catch dictators off guard, but tough regimes, the security services usually figure it out within a month or two. And that's one of the consistent things we've.
But you just posted a blog post last week where you took on Evgeny Morozov, and basically your argument, as I understood it, was that despite this back and forth cat and mouse game, your argument is that as societies go more online, they generally don't become more authoritarian.
Right. Yeah, that's right. And the specific debate with him is over whether there are any good examples of high-tech countries that are also highly authoritarian, and I say there aren't very many good examples. But digital media is, one of the things we argue in the book is that it's actually a mistake to peg any sensible theory of modern democratization to a particular tool. Mm-hmm. So you'll never hear us speaking about Twitter revolutions or Facebook revolutions. It's obviously a suite of tools. It's difficult to know what's coming next. We don't want to peg our theory of modern democratization to a particular application.
So what is it pegged to then? I mean, what is the mechanism that you see operating?
Could you repeat that?
But what's the mechanism that you see operating that makes these online or wired societies more likely to be democratic?
It's a great big question, but to boil it down simply, I think we can contrast the different media systems and communication networks that existed before digital media as broadcast networks, which were more hierarchical, top-down, easier to co-opt from a regime perspective. Digital media, on the other hand, there are several points at which control can be sought after, but by its nature, it is a much more heterogeneous type of communication system itself. So we pay attention to the political, economic angles about where certain corporations are based and how easy or difficult it was for regimes to try to co-opt those internationally. So globalization is something that very much impacts the discussion that we try to engage with here.
Now, I mean, this book was written at a time when I think the Arab Spring was more of a hopeful moment, and now things are looking pretty grim. What is the effect of the digital media that you're describing on divided societies, a Syria, a Bahrain, or for that matter, even in Egypt, when now we see deep polarization between Islamists and their opponents? Does it have the negative effects as well as positive effects?
There are definitely complex effects, and that's why we ended up with a title that is Democracy's Fourth Wave ? Right? So most of our argument
hedging the bets.
hedging the bets. So most of our argument concerns this, I guess, cascade of events that sort of had a beginning and has sort of had an end, with the crackdown in Bahrain extended, lock into civil war with Libya and Syria, of course. There can be negative consequences, but I would to digital media use, especially once regimes figure out how to manipulate people. There still seem to be moments that are the most likely moments for contesting political power, and those moments are rigged elections. So when the performance of a rigged election now is much more difficult in a world where people can call out the lie and share their experiences.
Kenya.
Like Kenya, or perhaps Iran is coming up, and one of the interesting
that'll be a test.
That'll be a test. One of the interesting things about Syria is that the regime did not really clamp down on mobile phone subscriptions, and they are up, right? So Syrians are actually the rate at which Syrians are looking for internet connections and buying up mobile phones has greatly increased, in part because of the crisis. Because in moments of crisis, that technology access to friends and family becomes really important.
But so, I mean, there's one model where you see regimes or governments figuring out how to fight back, and you've got great stories about that, and we've talked about that a bit. What about when the societies themselves are actually divided, though? I mean, what if it's not just that the Bahraini government is hiring people to go and destroy the online environment, but when you actually have these deep divisions, which are then being revealed online or manifested online?
I think in terms of the optimistic lens that we begin the book and pay attention to the complexities involved with digital media, clearly there's a difference between the phase of launching protests, finding mutually shared grievances, and now the difficult work ahead of actually institutionalizing the ambitions and the hopes of the folks that turned out for these momentous events. Even still, as things become more long-term and difficult to work with at the institutional change level, we still can observe in many instances where digital media allow various minority perspectives to document their experiences, learn from other experiences from neighboring countries going through similar experiences like that. So digital media as a overarching kind of a new tool, a set of tools introduced to a society, I think, really allow collective memories to be established and lessons to be shared across time and regions.
What do you make of the Cass Sunstein kind of argument that actually what happens is that social media, as opposed to broadcast media, will tend to form these bubbles? And so it'll actually intensify sectarian hatred, or the stories that are told will be stories unique to one social network and not shared with another social network. So pro-Assad and anti-Assad Syrians live in entirely different narrative universes now.
True. Yeah.
I mean, do you agree with that, or do you think that there's forces that push against that we should be paying attention to?
For better or worse, the evidence on that mostly comes from the United States. So it's in actually the most developed countries where the bubbles seem to rise and keep people from being exposed to each other's ideas. One of the things I think political scientists will find innovative, or people interested in politics will find innovative about this project, is that we do a fuzzy set statistics model that tests several different kinds of variables, including the rise of subnational groups and linguistic fractionalization. And those variables drop away. It turns out that the two most consistent variables explaining most of the cases in the Arab Spring concern the diffusion of internet access, mobile phone access, and fuel wealth. So I would go back to this. I'd actually, rather than speak of the popular opinion bubbles, I'd talk about natural gas, because it seems to be this ability to co-opt elites and keep the military well paid. That's one of the most important factors.
So what do you see then if you look at some place like Saudi Arabia or the Gulf, where you have very strong states, you have the oil wealth and the like, but you also have incredibly wired populations? And Saudi Arabia is a good example of that. What would you predict then? Do you see this as likely to push towards democratization in the Gulf, or does the institutional and oil factor kind of give you pause?
That's a great question. In the sense of the changes happening through societies that are wired, existing in very well-financed censorship regimes, I think we should pay closer attention to small p politics. What's happening at the family level of gender politics when certain tools get introduced into a family environment? How does that introduction change the patterns of who uses what, when, for what reasons? Even at the level of youth politics is, I think, another important lens to look at. We've seen, youth movements have engaged in public spaces physically, but digital media is another form of public space where their ambitions and hopes are tested out. So although places like Saudi Arabia have very well-financed, sophisticated digital censorship and surveillance technologies, we can still look at the small p politics about what's happening there.
So you and I have debated this before, how to interpret what happened in Iran in the summer of 2009,
Right.
And several people call it the revolution that didn't happen, and I think of it as the revolution that almost happened. Right? I think that Saudi Arabia is an example of a country that's built from the ground up a culture of internet use that includes self-surveillance. So from the very beginning, the Saudi Ministry of Culture and Communications has been actively collecting websites for banning. The public just nominates content that the rest of the public shouldn't be seeing. I would look more to Iran as an example of a country that is exceptionally wired, has a very vibrant blogosphere. They don't talk about politics all the time. Most of the time it's poetry and love, and it's a range of other things. But in moments of crisis, that's when they switch onto politics. And I think the few interesting examples of civil society activism in Saudi Arabia, the driving campaign for women, those in a sense have been made possible through SMS, mobile phone ties between people. But I'm not going to say that the House of Saud is limited, right?
So, so when you're looking around now, you would look at Iran 2013 as kind of a big test case.
An interesting test case, yeah. It's and it's an interesting test case because the government learned from 2009 and has so aggressively gone after the Green Movement, the remnants of the Green Movement over Facebook.
Okay, Phil Howard, Muzammil Hussain, Democracy's Fourth Wave, Digital Media in the Arab Spring. Thanks.
Thank you,
Thank
Marc.
you.
Cheers.